Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's my privilege to welcome back to the show a former guest and a friend, Ben Gosden. Ben is a pastor in Savannah, Georgia, and he has just released an outstanding book, Grace Rediscovered, Finding Hope and Healing Through Faith and Recovery. This is a great book where Ben unpacks addiction and how to recover from it. In particular, he shares, as he did in his first podcast episode, his victory over alcoholism. This book is rich, and our conversation today is a deep dive into theology, into writing, into how to sit with uncomfortable feelings, the role that Christian faith has in helping us to break free of addictions. You're going to find this episode really meaningful. And if you do, I would appreciate it if you would share it, if you would like it, and if you'd like to continue to stay up to date with this podcast, please consider subscribing. If I can be of service to you, reach out, Brian at brianrussellphd.com. You can check out my website, brianrussellphd.com. And I will say, if you're listening to this in February or early March of 2025, I am about to launch the fifth cohort of my program, Deeper. This is a 12-month soul journey for pastors and or spiritual leaders. You can find out a little bit more information about that at brianrussellphd.com/deeper. Go to the show notes for a direct link. Now let's jump into my conversation with Ben Gosden on his outstanding new book, Grace Rediscovered. Hey, Ben, great to have you back on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
No, so happy that you have the book that came out, and we're going to talk today about your first book that you published, Grace Rediscovered, Finding Hope and Healing Through Faith and Recovery. To immediately jump back in, talk about how you came about writing this book, and so where does this book come from in your personal life?
So, as of this interview, I'm just over 3 years sober. For me, this book really kind of came at a point. I was sober for about a little over 2 years. And I've always wanted to write a book and just kind of been stumped about what to write about. And somewhere in there, I guess I just began to wonder, could I write through this recovery process? Sort of reflecting back, obviously, you can't necessarily write about it as you go through it. And it really became this cathartic experience of writing about what recovery meant to me, my journey of recovery. But even more than that, through the book, is beginning to unpack and write about those difficult things that we all have that may come from childhood, may come from trauma at some point in your life, may come from some kind of difficulty that, that lives underneath the surface in your soul. And a big piece of recovery is beginning to understand those things and be more aware of those things. It's not that you're getting rid of them, but you learn how to live with them in a little bit different way. And so the book really was kind of a cathartic experience of working through a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, just looking at the title for a minute, I think the subtitles is really clear, finding hope and healing through faith and recovery. Oh, and by the way, Ben was my guest. It's been a couple years now on an earlier podcast episode where he says some different things and he shares pretty openly. And you were a lot closer to the beginning of your recovery journey, I think, the last time you were on. So please check out the show notes for another deep dive with Ben. That was a profound initial conversation. The actual title itself, Grace Rediscovered. Talk about that a little bit beyond probably what maybe is obvious. It's like, how was grace lost in your life? Maybe like, what's it mean that you had to rediscover grace?
Yeah, that's a great question. And nobody has really asked. It was a very purposeful title, and I've done a few podcasts, and no one's asked about that yet. So thank you for asking.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I think by by definition, grace is a gift that comes to us from God. We don't self-manufacture grace. And it is often surprising. So it comes either in maybe it's the timing of grace that makes it surprising. Maybe it's the abundance of grace that makes it surprising. But grace is this profound gift that comes from God. And for me, the whole turn of rediscovered. I've been a church kid my whole life. I've grown up in the church. I've lived in the church. I work for the church now. Church has been an integral aspect of my life for 42 years. And while I know intellectually a lot about church and grace and scripture and all these things, recovery for me was probably the most profound ongoing experience of the transformative power and the redemptive power of God's grace that I've ever experienced. And it's funny to say because I've been a pastor for over 15 years, which means, if you do the math, I said I was 3 years sober. Number of those years, I was functioning alcoholic. Mm-hmm. And I preached grace, sometimes better than others, I'm sure. But I don't know that I ever knew it down in the soul of my being, the way that God has revealed God's self in such a profound way through my healing and recovery journey. So yeah, it's like a thing or you think and now you really know it. Good. And so recovery for me is a gift in that way, that it is teaching me something I thought I understood, and it turns out I don't think I barely knew anything about grace in many ways compared to now.
Yeah. Let me just make an immediate theological detour based on what you just said, and I love that. And my own experience would go along with what you just said in connect that with our Wesleyan faith a little bit. And again, I'm not asking for a testimony about entire sanctification now, but you're almost describing, because you're not denying that you were saved by grace initially, but it's in a sense that really landed. So how does that fit into your understanding how God works in our lives in terms of Christian perfection, holiness of heart and life, if you've thought any about that?
Yeah, we think about prevenient, prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace in this sequence. And it does happen often. You can reflect back on your life and look at it in sequential order. At the same time, I'm grateful for a Wesley theological professor in seminary who said it's also very circular. You come back to prevenient grace. You come back to your justifying grace. You come back to your sanctifying grace. So it's not a one and done kind of thing. It's not just that prevenient grace is, that grace, we're baptized as infants and God's grace goes before us, and then confirmation. Like those things happen, but there's also moments of prevenient grace that happen. It was prevenient grace for me to be appointed to a city that has such a drinking culture attached to it, like Savannah. And that's weird to say. And it was, for a season, the worst thing for my disease. And yet, where there is a profound drinking culture, it turns out there's also a profound culture of recovery. And so there is a number of people in recovery in this town as well. And I get to know them in such a unique way. And so I think there's a prevenient nature to that grace. And for justifying grace, I would say, Wesley, I don't know that I would say this was an Aldersgate experience. I mean, that we all want to say that we have one like Wesley, but Wesley knew that there was being saved that he learned. And then there was this interruption to his life that God made that salvation so palpable that he almost relives it and reclaims it. And for me, it wasn't a moment like an Aldersgate moment like Wesley had, but it was the slow unfolding of recovery that I felt what Wesley felt of this palpable nature of God's saving grace at work in my life. And yeah, I would say that the sanctification piece, we in recovery, we say, we live one day at a time. It's one of these cliches that is so true. And I would say that's the definition of sanctification, that you just live into the goodness of God one day at a time. And you don't always know where you're going, where you're headed. But when you reflect back, you see where God's brought you. So, for me, I love the image of, you have a road to Damascus experience where God strikes you blind and all of that. Bill W., the founder of the Alcoholics Anonymous program, loved the road to Damascus story and being struck and his testimony in a hospital room is a great light that he saw. For me, it was more the road to Emmaus. It was the slow unfolding that the risen Christ, I think, was walking alongside me. And it's only in looking back that I go, oh yeah, he was there. Oh yeah, he brought me here. Oh yeah. And so yeah, that's the sanctification piece that we just, have the duty, the delight, and the gift to live into every day.
Good. Let's talk about the writing process. We have friends that are interested in writing books. We have lots of friends who've written books, and I know a lot of folks here. A lot of pastors feel like we have books in us or whatever. Like, what did you learn about the writing process? What was your writing process to produce Grace Rediscovered?
Yeah, so the writing process, I would say, is part art form and a big piece because I have an analytical brain. I had to take that art form and put it into some analytical habits and patterns. I wish that I could just wax poetically about the writing process and, just how I spend hours pontificating, but I get distracted or lazy or, and the words never get on paper. So I had to break it into an actual process. A friend early on told me their husband, who's PhD and this wrote a big dissertation and book and everything, he put a note on his computer that said, like, 500 words, dummy, or something like that. And that was his daily reminder, just write 500 words. Well, I broke that into 250. I said 250 words, dummy, or whatever, but it was a post-it note on my computer that said, if every day I can just produce 250 words, then I'm making progress. And so, the old adage about how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? I tell people, how do you write a book? You just do it one chapter, one section, one subsection, one paragraph at a time. So I sort of worked the math and kind of went backwards because I'd never written a book. So I said to myself, well, I've written lots of blog posts. And if a blog post is 500 to 1,000 words, then maybe every chapter can have like 3 to 4 blog posts in it. So then you do the math, that makes every chapter 2,500 to 4,000 words times 7, 8, 9, 10 chapters, and you've got a book. So then you just kind of do that. And so I spent pretty much the entire summer writing on an almost daily basis. It was either early in the morning, like at 5 a.m., because I'm an early bird, or it was I would just kind of block off time, at least an hour later in the day. But a friend who's written many books, he also said, like, if you can just steal 15 minutes, just sit down, churn out 15 minutes, another 100 words, and then get up and walk away. So it's kind of a weird way of explaining the process, but I wish it was profound and, artistic, but it really is. You got to sit down and write it. And so for me, I had to break down the math of it. And then as I got into the flow of it, I loved it. I was almost sad to finish it, with the cathartic experience piece of it. I told somebody recently, it was like when you send your child off to kindergarten and you're going, oh, I don't want you out there in the world. I just want you to stay here with me. So I felt some of that, grief and sadness, I guess, that I kind of let it go. And now it's out there.
So good. It's good. Yeah, great advice. And again, it resonates. I think most people, Well, I know a couple people that can sit for hours and do 10, 15,000 words in a day. That's beyond my powers. I'm a 500 word person. That's usually my goal, and good day goes a little bit more, but yeah, it's consistency. And yeah, and everybody, the whole secret is just what Ben said, because I mean, I'm the most distracted person imaginable, and so I literally just, I'm down at, I'll be 56 this year. It's like I'm down to, I try to write 20-minute bursts, and if I can get a two, three 20-minute bursts in a day, I got my 500 words. And so I mean,
Yeah.
and magically you run the math on that, 500 by a couple hundred days of writing. That's a couple long books if we could actually do that,
Yeah.
right? So it's so
Yeah.
good. Yeah, thank you, Ben. Now, before we get into specifics of Grace Rediscovered, let's just talk about addiction for just a couple of minutes. And again, I know this could be a whole podcast, but talk about your present understanding about what addiction is. And again, I mean, we're asking for something superficial with the amount of time, but like maybe what are some misconceptions that people have about it? Again, your particular flavor was alcoholism. I would say mine workaholism. And, I just did a whole episode on that on this podcast. But like, what do you think what's something that people get wrong about addiction? And maybe even first, like, how do you understand what that word means?
Yeah. So I wish that I could like spit out all these scientific, studies and data points and stuff. So this is very just my generic sort of living understanding of addiction. I believe that addiction has three components to it. There is a physiological component, there is a psychological, emotional component, and there's a spiritual component. And to say which, I don't know that they're equal thirds, or it could just show up in different ways. There's a physiological component, that it is when you drink alcohol, when you take addictive drugs or recreational drugs or whatever, you are ingesting a substance that touches on places in your brain, dopamine receptors and whatnot, that will put you at risk of your body saying, that felt good, give it to me again. And people, there's more and more new research coming out that they think people with addiction issues may have more sensitive dopamine receptors. So what may feel good, for you to have a glass or two of bourbon, for me feels great.
Mm.
And so people who struggle with addiction, they may have, more sensitive dopamine receptors. Who knows? I mean, so there's a physical piece to it, that when you ingest an addictive substance, you are putting yourself at risk to want to keep having that. There's also, we know, a physiological piece to it, because when you go into rehab, they have to wean your body off of it. And so you have to be without the substance to stop craving the substance. I also think that there's obviously physiological component to it, that there's genetics at play. If you are the child or grandchild of a person who with addiction, your likelihood of also, having issues with addiction are higher. I mean, they're just, it's there. Most addicts have addicts in their family. So that's the physiological piece. However, if that were all there was to addiction, we would just throw everybody in 90 days of rehab, dry them out, and then, they would be done. Well, what makes them keep going back? Well, then you get into the mental and the emotional piece of it. That there's psychological things there. I always say that, alcoholism is my disease, but alcohol itself was not the disease. It was my solution.
Yeah, it's good.
Because the real disease is my dis-ease with life. I'm not comfortable in my own skin. And I think more and more of us, when we're being honest and self-aware, would probably confess that there's lots of things we do to feel relief from the dis-ease of our human condition. We work a lot because we like praise and, whatever, payoff we get from work. Maybe it's making money. Maybe it's admiration. Maybe it's just being able to brag to all your friends that, you work 80 hours a week and whatever. We eat, if we're not careful, we eat sugar. touches many of the similar dopamine receptors that alcohol does. Ask anybody in a recovery room how much ice cream they've eaten lately, and they'll all laugh,
Oh, it's
because
funny.
sugar is a big deal to people in recovery, because we go, yeah, boy, that one touches some things that, alcohol used to help with. But we use these things. Pornography. We use all kinds of things that can be addictive to help relieve us from the dis-ease of the human condition. It's hard to sit with your feelings, and it's hard to sit in difficult circumstances, so we look for relief. I am a high functioning person who's a type A, who in many ways you'd say I'm gifted, because I have a high capacity for work, and in other ways that is a hindrance to me, because I love when people admire me. And so I just work. I'll say yes to everything. I'll do all the things. I mean, you've helped me for years now try to understand things like boundaries and limits and like healthy pacing to life. And that stress would build up in me every day, and then alcohol was what would soothe me. So there's that emotional and sort of psychological piece that you have to reckon with your feelings and experiences as human. Now, the spiritual side of that is, I'm a big believer in the 12 steps. And the 12th step, it has this beautiful preface to it that says, having had a spiritual awakening. Bill Wilson believed that the process of working the steps was literally the goal of the 12 steps was to have a spiritual awakening, to know God in a way that you did not know God on the front end. The doctor, the advice the doctors note at the beginning of the big book for Alcoholics Anonymous, the doctor's opinion. The doctor basically says, look, we've treated people. We've treated the mental, the emotional, psychological, physiological, and people still wouldn't stay clean. And the doctor basically says they've tapped into a spiritual cure, and people are staying clean. And he's like, I'm a scientist and don't fully understand it, but basically there's something to this. You and I know that as trained theologians, and probably one of the greatest gifts in my life is that I've experienced and experience on a daily basis as a human the saving power of God.
Yeah.
And that's the spiritual component to addiction, that there is hope, there is a cure, and that cure is a daily, as the big book tells us, the daily working out of our spiritual condition, that we are more likely to stay sober if our spiritual condition is more fit. So those are the three sort of aspects of addiction. I mean, there's lots of misconceptions out there, that it's a moral issue. I think anybody who wants to say that someone, lacks morality, I'm a preacher. You know how many times I've preached hungover? More than I care to share.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know that. I think we can talk about sin in ways that does not have to indict people for some crime. I think sin is a reflection of our brokenness, and we don't fully understand it. And of course, it does show up in ways that are hurtful. But I was mostly hurting myself.
Yeah.
I pray. One of my prayers, and we can talk about prayer more because I know that's a big thing for you too, is that each day I learn to love myself more in the way that God loves me. Because I can tell you, I knew that drinking was bad for me, and I couldn't stop. I knew it was an issue, and I couldn't do anything about it. And I finally just stopped caring. I was like, well, I don't really love myself all that much anyways. Who cares?
That's good.
So it's a big thing with addiction, that you understand it's not a moral failing. It's more a symptom of the brokenness that we all have as human beings. If anything, the addiction is an attempt to deal with the God-sized hole in our soul that we don't really know what to do with, and only God can fill it, kind of
That's good.
thing.
Yeah, it's so good. So good. No, yeah, I loved what you just said, and I saw, and even I think the one key thing that I've heard, and I think I learned this from Gabor Mate. He's got some really good books on addiction and healing and stuff, and you echoed it. It's the idea that, and I think it's important for everybody to hear that addiction is a solution, isn't a problem, it's a solution. But and the issue is it's actually a solution it's a bad solution to a deep problem on the inside. And I was trying to find a Richard Rohr quote that you echoed something and about, he has a quote, and I think it's from Falling Upwards, and you may recall this, and I wish I could find it, but he says something like, don't, how does he say it? Something like, don't let, it has to do with a sin, like something like, you don't want to be liberated from a sin until you figured out what that sin was supposed to teach you. Do you recall reading
Mm.
something like that? And I need to look.
No,
And
that's yeah.
yeah, I didn't get it right, but and let's just kind of jump from a statement like that, which could be sort of shocking to folks. Again, Ben and I are not advocating for for sinning boldly, because I think St. Paul says something about that. But when we're
Yeah.
talking about breaking out of addictions, to simply call it a sin defeats the purpose, because what Ben's story here, and that he's so clear articulate in the book, and I would even echo this for some of the experience I've had in my life, is God can do great things through failings and struggles that we have, if we have the courage to lean in. And if you read Ben's book, you're going to hear the story of a man who had the courage to lean in. And your opening chapter is on powerlessness, or like one of the opening chapters is on that. And so, talk a little bit about that as maybe the gateway. Is that the gateway to healing? Powerlessness?
Yeah, I think so, because the first step is to admit that we have a problem, that we're powerless over alcohol.
Yeah.
And I would just stretch that for people who, it may not be alcohol, but it could be anything that you're trying to work through in your life, and to say that, I have a problem and I'm powerless over it. It opens you to the second step, which is that God can save you. And then step three is, so first three steps can be summed up in, I can't, God can. Step three, I think I'll let God.
Mm.
Step three simply says to make a decision to give my life and my will over to the love and care of God. So powerlessness is that, letting go of trying to be God, because trying to be God gets us into a mess. It gets us into misery and despair. It gets us into all kinds of things. For me, it was living into an addiction to try to solve the dis-ease in my soul. Other people, it may not be alcohol, but it may be something else, trying to control other people's lives. Someone controlling your, whatever it is. Excuse me. But admitting our powerlessness really is a way of letting go of the fiction that somehow we're God, or we can be as powerful as God. We can't control people, places, or things. We can only control our reaction to them. And that's a hard truth about life, because we want to think we can control lots of things, but we can't. So embracing that powerlessness is a way of saying, I need to stop being God and let God be God, and get myself right in this equation, so that I can truly give my life and my will over to the love and care of God. This idea of giving your life to Jesus, I mean, you and I are evangelical, right? I mean, we've heard this all our lives, give your life to Jesus. I've always thought, like, what does that really mean? Give
Yeah,
my
that's
life
right.
to Jesus. And I'll tell you one thing it does not mean, but I thought it meant, give my life to Jesus except for the parts that I want to hold on to.
Man.
Give my life to Jesus except for the parts that I think I actually know better, and I'm a self-sufficient American, person who can buy my way, think my way, earn my way out of or into something. To give my life to Christ is what Bonhoeffer said to come and die so that we can be raised in a different way, in new life. And that's a daily journey. And it
Yeah.
begins in powerlessness.
Yeah, and I love the connection. I loved, yeah, you have that Bonhoeffer quote somewhere in the book, and it's just a great reminder because it's so powerful. And you use phrases early, first third, I guess, of the book of being right sized. Yeah, and sometimes when we talk about Jesus raising us up or giving our life to Jesus, and I've used this language myself for motivation, though I think looking back, I can see that I don't mind the word, but I probably wished I wouldn't have used it as much. We talk about extraordinary. When I read your book, one of the things I appreciated about it, well, and also I didn't like it because, I have to say I've always wanted to be extraordinary, and I think it's some of the roots of my own. That would be the roots of my own workaholism problems that I've run
Yeah,
into on and off. You have just a great. You use the phrase "right sized," and it's almost
yeah,
like instead of wanting to be extraordinary, all we should want to be is ordinary, the person that God made us to be. So just reflect on a little bit about that
yeah.
and how that plays into addiction. I love that part of your book.
So it's the paradox
Yeah,
of the life
yeah,
of recovery, but it's the paradox of the Christian life.
yes.
In my weakness, Christ is made strong. And it's out of my weakness that I'm made strong in Christ. But as long as I'm trying to exert my own strength, I'm nothing but weak. And so my weakness was that my great secret was that I hated the fact that I drank every day.
Mm,
And I would wake up with shame and despair in the mornings, and I would go for a run or I'd go work out something. I had all kinds of hacks and tricks to just sweat it out, um, and quickly hydrate so I could get over this hangover. Hangovers are physically debilitating, but more than that, just the shame, like, of it all, trying to cover up for it, going to meetings and being afraid someone's going to smell the alcohol coming out of your pores, stuff like that. I portrayed an image of being a strong, functioning pastor of a growing church and all these things. And the truth was, I'm only as strong as my secrets. And the secret was, I couldn't stop. And I wanted to. And I would tell myself in the morning, stop, I'm not going to drink like that tonight. And then, like clockwork, 8:30 p.m. would come. I would sit down with my first cocktail, and I would go from there till midnight. Every night it was like a little escape hatch I would just go into, turn on whatever's on TV, or follow along on Twitter or whatever. I mean, just stupid, mindless stuff. But it was this weakness I didn't know what to do with, and my trying to exert strength in its place, it didn't help. It was only in embracing the fact that I'm weak, I'm not as strong as I think I am, and I bring myself into a more proper size, that then God's strength can live in and through me. Part of being right size too is maybe you think of yourself as too small.
that's
We
true.
pray the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity, to essentially to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And we get stuck on that acceptance piece, which is huge. To accept the things I can't change today, big deal. But there's also a piece of asking for courage to change the things I can, that God can. I actually can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Not when I'm trying to use my own strength, but when I'm utterly dependent upon the strength of God. Then I can really do some things I never imagined. And so the right size piece is just getting yourself into a right size, either bigger or smaller than you wrongly think you might be, but that you can put yourself in perspective to align yourself with the power of God that can live and move and have its being in you.
That's good. And thank you for actually also clarifying that being right size means God may make you bigger than you are, because in some ways an addiction it works on both sides of things, right? A person can feel so little of themselves that the drink, yeah, it's two different kinds of wounds. You're escaping yourself, but some of us need to be elevated, some of us need to be de-elevated, I think is what I'm hearing in this. And that's a really powerful word for, I think, everybody listening.
Yeah. And it's thinking of yourself and being rigorously honest. How do you show up in places? Do you show up in ways that you try to be bigger than you are, but the truth is it's because you fear someone's going to think you're smaller than you really are? And so you overcompensate. And I think for most of us, we probably live in that weird pendulum of feeling too small, acting too big, being too big, acting too small, but it's finding the balance between there, that requires some humility, powerlessness. You embrace that, and then you kind of find yourself into proper perspective with God.
Good. And one more question around addiction itself, then I want to skip towards the end of the book and pick up some of the aspects of the recovery itself. But you're pretty clear that you don't feel comfortable in your own skin, and I think that's almost a universal piece. And then addiction is finding bad solutions to that, not being able to feel comfortable in your own skin. And so that literally means you get confronted with feelings. And I love a quote that you put in there. I think it's, "We can't heal what we can't feel." So part of breaking the bondage is you just have to be able to feel, and let yourself feel emotions. And obviously, most of us have no problem feeling joy, but it's the painful ones, the memories, the shame, the guilt, the fear, anxiety, all that stuff that kind of creeps up. So how, and you can speak from experience or just give some strategies, how does one learn to actually feel the feelings and be able to handle the bodily sensations that crop up without a quote drink or whatever its equivalent would be? Me working so I don't have to deal with my feelings, other person looking at porn, a person eating too much, anything that we're addicted to. So how does one learn to deal with their feelings and feel their feelings and just hang on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll use a story that a friend told me, friend in recovery. He said that, something going on with work, and, he's super anxious, and it was like the weekend, and whatever it was happened on Friday and wasn't going to be resolved until Monday. And, we've all had those weekends where like we're just dreading it, and you're playing out in your head, I said and they said, and then it gets mixed into the tape of I wish that I'd said, and, then they would have, you play out all these fictional conversation. I mean, our mind goes.
Yes.
And he said, and this is a guy in recovery, and he said, I found myself like with all this angst building up in my chest. And I asked myself, how do I get rid of this? And he said, the first thought I had was, well, you used to drink. And this guy's been in recovery for a while. He's like, well, I can't do that. So what do I do? And he's having this internal conversation at that point. And he said, you know what I did? I sat down on the couch, I turned out the lights, and I closed my eyes. And I just sat there. And I didn't play out the conversations, but I just kept telling myself, I'm going to sit here and I'm just going to feel this. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to feel this. And he said, you know what happened? After about 7, 8 minutes, 90% of that anxiety was gone. And then he says, I'll be damned. I spent 20 something years drinking over something that took about 7 minutes just to get over finally. The secret is that we sit with it. There's nothing you can do except bear witness to your feelings. Now, I tend to believe, like Mr. Rogers once taught us, feelings are our friends. Uncomfortable ones can teach us, but they're part of the human condition. If it helps, someone told me, think of the uncomfortable feelings as temporary house guests.
Yes.
They're there for a week and then they're going to leave. You're not going to feel the despair forever. You're not going to feel the stress forever. sometimes you have to feel it in the moment. And I've asked my sponsor, what do I do about, this? And he said, sit with it. You just sit with it. And you just, that's where the acceptance piece comes in. Sometimes the great prayer we can pray is, help me just accept the tension of this moment. I can't do anything about it, but I can just, I can accept that it's here, it's real. I don't need to make it bigger than it has to be, but I don't need to diminish it and try to hide it either. I just need to sit with it and bear witness to it.
Good. Yeah, and let's talk about prayer for a couple of minutes. I was going to make that one of the last questions, but I think this is, you've interjected that. And I would, just say, and people that listen to this podcast, I do talk a lot about centering prayer, and that is one of the fruits. And I know even the 12-step recovery sometimes uses centering prayer as one of its step 11 practices or whatever.
Yeah.
But sitting in silence is, well, just exactly what this anecdote said, without calling that centering prayer, and I guess it wasn't. He was just literally silence, but silence heals if you
Yes.
can just hang on. And so talk a little bit about rule of life, how that helps in this recovery process, and specifically talk about prayer and what role prayer plays in recovery process, dealing with feelings and just opening ourselves up a little bit more to what God really wants to do deep inside of us.
Yeah. I mean, I say now so people understand, they tend to think of preachers as like super spiritual humans. And the truth is, I really didn't pray all that much.
Mhm.
I mean, I sort of prayed. I prayed for four things. God, give me this, give me that, give me the other,
Yeah.
Um, I prayed with people, um, for people, that kind of thing. But in terms of a daily prayer life of my own, it's kind of like how it's hard to read scripture as a preacher because you tend to just read it for what you want to extrapolate and give in a sermon. Sometimes the most important work we can do with spiritual practices is hoard it for ourselves as pastors. And so I don't know that I learned to pray until I was in recovery. And that's because prayer is such an important piece of the 12-step process. There's a big piece in the big book that says, upon awakening. Upon awakening is when you pray. I have known guys in recovery who have said that they put their bedroom shoes under their bed so that when they get out of bed, they have to get down on their knees and get them, and that's their cue to pray. Now,
That's awesome.
I mean
Yeah.
that's cool, isn't it? I mean, I don't do that, but I'm like, wow, because they took the big book literally. It said, upon awakening, we put ourselves in a posture of prayer and we pray for the day ahead. For me, I'm a big gym person now because where I didn't love my physical self as much, now I try to take care of it. And I go to the gym and I lift heavy weights and I love every minute of it. But it's my drive to the gym that I pray every morning for the day. And I pray for a variety of things. I mean, I like to think that, I'd start and end the prayer with gratitude. I'm grateful for a new day. I'm grateful to be up early because I love the early mornings. Um, I try to give thanks every day, even after 1,130 days as of today that I've been sober. It never gets old. Yeah, I keep waiting for it to get old hat to wake up and be sober, but every day I'm like, you know what? It's amazing to wake up and feel sober. And I thank God every day. Thank you for helping me be sober this morning. I'm so grateful. Um, I go through some things repeat every day, some things vary. I pray for acceptance. Help me accept life as it comes. Um, I love, lately I've been on this kick and I've been sharing with people. I love to link our United Methodist baptismal liturgy with my recovery prayer. And so step 3 is to give our life and our will over to the love and care of God. I pray, give my life and my will over to the love and care of God. Help me be entirely willing to put my whole trust in your grace, O God. And that's from our baptismal liturgy, to put our whole trust in your grace. The willingness is key in recovery because where you feel like I can't do this, just pray that God makes you willing. Just willing to try, willing to be open, willing to be receptive. I pray for patience, humility, kindness, because I need it. People piss me off, and I need I need to be humble. I pray to love myself well, so that I can show up and love others well. I pray to be of service, so that I remember a lot of days my prayers, so that I remember that my life is not my own, but it's to be shared as a gift. So yeah, I mean, there's some aspects of that, but it's kind of a daily thing, and it sounds boring and it's not really flowery or anything, but I find doing it every day, I can't fully explain it, but it does something to me, both each day and over time.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I think to put a word on it, it's building a container and it's putting in, reps, just like you go to the gym. And I mean, we're talking about spiritual practices, and if we want to be followers of God, we want to receive God's grace. I mean, this is why Wesley called these things the means of grace. And so sometimes talking about them, like, oh, the pastor just wants me to read the Bible and pray, blah blah blah. Well, yeah, if that's how it's going to be, it's not going to do anything. But when we get to the point in our lives where it's a must, yeah, it might sound boring to describe and it's not flashy, but guess what? These are the things that the saints have been doing for millennia. And why would we think that
Yeah,
we're any better than the saints?
yeah, absolutely.
So thanks for the test. Do you have like 10 more minutes? I mean, I'm loving this
Yeah,
conversation. You have some time? Okay, okay, we'll go. Okay. I wanted to touch on one real specific metaphor that I really liked, and I'd never heard of this. It's a Japanese word. I think we said you pronounce it kintsugi. Talk about that metaphor as and how you connect that with recovery. Because I really like that part of the book.
yeah. So kintsugi is a Japanese ancient art form that takes broken pottery and sort of creates something new out of it by using like a liquid adhesive that has like gold flakes and particles. I mean, it can vary, but basically, you take something broken and you make something new out of it, and you have this beautiful sort of gold colored thing that holds the broken pieces together, so that when you look at the art itself, you can see the gold, in it, and you say, "Wow, I, just thought that was a broken piece of pottery." I love the illustration for many reasons. Obviously, you can go off of some theological truths there of, redeeming all these things, um, beauty shining through our brokenness, all that kind of stuff. I love it for many respects, one of which is it's an art form that says nothing is worth throwing away. And I truly believe no human being is worth throwing away. And there's complicated circumstances that every human being has, but we don't throw the person away. What do we do instead? We can find redemption. And that's where kintsugi can take even the most broken people we know and, by God's grace, bind them together in a way that beauty shines, um, often in unexpected ways. So yeah, it's a beautiful art form that for me is a wonderful metaphor for the life of transformation and redemption in God's grace.
No, love it. Well, let me ask you a few kind of closing questions. Like for you, you've hinted that you get up, you pray, you go to the gym, but what does your rule of life or container for your life look like that allows you to stay grounded, stay sober, stay faithful?
Yeah, so my sobriety is the most important thing to me. And I know for Christians, they might flinch and say, no, it's supposed to be Jesus. I would say Jesus in my life on a daily basis works in and through my recovery in a primary way. And so if I'm sober, then I know the healing power of God. And if I know the healing power of God a little more that day, I can offer it to others. So my sobriety is first. My family is second. And by the way, part of that sobriety is also caring for myself in ways that I haven't always cared for myself. So I try to eat good within reason. I love sweets and stuff like that. But I mean, mostly eat good. Go to the gym because I love it. Moving my body, staying flexible, just being strong, um, that kind of thing. Um, but I try to love my family. Work comes down the list, and that's not honestly always been the case with me.
Hmm.
Learning to function at a capacity that gives me a thin line of margin. I was talking about this last week with someone who said, "What does it mean to build margin?" And I said, "It just simply means you don't schedule one thing to the next thing to the next thing. You build your life in a way that says, instead of having 15 or 18 things on a to-do list, what if you had six? And you pick the six most important ones and you just did those. And you say, what do I do with the time in between? I don't know. Think, be quiet, do something that you love." Listen to music. I don't know, but organize my life in a way that I try to have a thin layer of margin throughout my life. Now, some days get busier than others, and all of that, but accepting my limitations is a big part of my rule of life. To do things that are life giving and not just out of obligation. I try to ask myself, do I feel like I should do this? You and I have talked about a lot about how shoulds are the worst thing in the world. I should do this. Should you?
No.
What if you just did things you love and then, forgot some about the shoulds, and, maybe a should comes back later, but a should be something that brings you joy too. So a big piece of my rule of life is learning to say no.
Yeah, and then just remember, a should that brings you joy is a must.
That's
And,
right.
and it's a
That's right.
total game changer at that point. That's why I always joke that
Absolutely.
you don't do no, you never do a should. It's either a won't or a must, and you can transform it. And that doesn't mean there's aren't things that we need to do. That's a different thing too. But should, no
Well, and
shoulds.
by the way, I also remember what you taught me, that sometimes the greatest gifts you have is when your must become a get to.
Yes,
Get to
yes,
do
yeah,
this. And that's a great. Not everything will make it there, but the things that do, they become the moorings on your life, so that you can get through the tough things because you have these things in it. So, big rule of life for me is balance, peace,
it's good.
acceptance, so that I can keep some margin, and not run myself so thin. I drank because I ran myself too thin in many ways. It's also because I didn't know what to do with feelings, and I didn't know what to do with some early childhood things that really wore on me. But from a day to day basis, I drank because I just didn't know how to accept my own limitations.
Good. And by the way, we didn't even get to the chapters. You have some great chapters on family stuff, both being a parent, but also growing up in a family that, and everyone's done that. You have some great comments on manhood built into the book, though. You also teased there might be something else coming after that. So
Yeah, 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 yeah. The quick and dirty on the manhood piece, and that's a big thing that for me, that I think toxic masculinity is one of the most harmful things to men in particular in our world today, because it inadvertently forms grown men to act like little boys
yeah,
about their
fair.
life. And we need
Yes,
to honor things like vulnerability and strength and humility and self-giving as something that real manhood is about, not all this pretend tough guy macho crap.
that's good. It's good. Yeah, we'll talk about um, what might be next for you. Are you working on another project? What do you think? What do you have another book in you there, Ben, that you might want to tease us a little bit with?
Yeah, so the next book that I think I'm going to start later this year is a book on accepting our imperfections. So it's sort of taking the kintsugi piece, and to say, if beauty comes through this transformative process, how do we really honor that beauty? So ways that we embrace our imperfections. So I'd say it's like a book two to this one. That will focus on the powerlessness, the right sized, need to be right sized, the need to give ourselves to God, that we embrace our limitations and accept ourselves for who God made us to be as a gift, and not try to be all the things we think we should be, or that others are, or that we're cool or beautiful or whatever artificial things we think we can be if we were just different. we just accept what and who we are as gifts from God and live into that. One of the quotes that has stuck with me recently that'll probably show up in this book. President Jimmy Carter died recently, and his grandson Jason Carter, at his eulogy at the National Cathedral, opened his eulogy in such a profound way. And he cited the contemporary Christian song that says, "From the moment that I wake up, my life sings of the glory of God." And he talks about how his grandfather, not many of us could say that, but his grandfather could say that from the moment he woke up, his life sang of the glory of God. And that stuck with me. And I thought, man, what if that was our only prayer? That every day, Lord, help my life sing of your glory and goodness. And so a big piece of that is accepting and embracing our imperfections, the things we think we hate, so that God's glory and goodness can shine through them.
Oh, it's so good. And now maybe the hardest question of all, and we joked a little bit about this at the beginning. But two or three book recommendations for maybe a person who wants to go deeper, or two or three books that have really helped you.
Yeah, that was such a hard question. So two books in the last year, I'll just give that.
Okay.
That really, really got me. One is Slow Productivity by Cal Newport. Game changer for the perfectionist, for the high functioning workaholic who thinks they can do all the things. Slow productivity will help guide you in a more healthy pace of living. Cal Newport's stuff is great there. There's also lots of podcasts that he's done, like Carey Nieuwhof and others, that I'd say go listen to those too and read the book, because it's wonderful. The second is a book called The Practice of Groundedness by Brad Stulberg. Brad Stulberg is one of these, like, I don't know, art of thinking people. Like, I don't want to call him, he's not a psychologist per se, but he studies like the art of thinking and mindset and mentality. He's big into athletic performance and things like that. But The Practice of Groundedness really, it's almost a companion to Slow Productivity. It's a push that Brad has of simplifying your life into the things that matter most, and really finding your grounding and living out of those things that matter most versus trying to do all the things and be all the things for all the people all the time.
All right. Well, thank you. That sounds like two really great books that I haven't actually looked at yet. So thank you. And last question, if where can people pick up a copy of Grace Rediscovered? Also, if folks want to get in touch with you, I know you do some limited speaking and some coaching. Like, what would be some ways for folks to get a hold of you and engage with you if they'd like to go a little deeper?
Yeah, thank you. So you can buy the book most anywhere. Amazon, my publisher is Stock. You can buy directly from them, but it's for sale on Barnes and Noble. For the Methodist out there, it is for sale through Cokesbury. So you can buy it there. One thing I'm actually going to be producing soon is a study guide to go along with it, in the hopes that maybe some small groups would want to use it for a Lent book study. So that'll be coming soon, and we're going to promote the Cokesbury link, especially for that one, so that folks can order multiple copies through their church account. But yeah, Amazon, of course, is out there, and most anywhere that you can buy books online. With the coaching piece, you asked that. I almost forgot. Ben Gosden coaching.com. So BenGosden coaching.com. There, I love to work with churches. I love to work with leaders. I love to work with just people. And a lot of it is 12-step-ish, I would say. There's an overarching theme to the powerlessness, the acceptance piece, but the courage to live into our most authentic selves, whether it's in leadership or organizationally, how to discern and find our most authentic selves that God calls us to be, and some practical steps to move into that. So I love working with people and groups and churches and businesses. BenGosdenCoaching.com. Would love to work with you there.
No, thank you very much, Ben. It has been a great conversation. I'm grateful for the God's call in your life. I'm grateful for your witness that you make, and thank you for pouring yourself in a very vulnerable way and sharing your own story, both on this podcast, but in a great book, Grace Rediscovered. So again, thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you, and I appreciate you sharing your platform, and always love coming on and sharing with you.
All right, and we want to thank everybody for listening all the way to the end of this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. Please share this with people that you would think would find it helpful. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. If I could be of service, you could reach out to me. I'll put my stuff in the show notes. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be a voice of hope to others.